Episode 5, Star Trek vs. Star Wars, The Dominion War. The Founders had infiltrated every aspect of the Empire, delaying data, forms, supplies, anything they could. They had moved all throughout the Star Wars universe, creating havoc. But back home, they had been secretly making plans with the Bree to form an alliance against the Empire. The Bree had agreed to join the Dominion, and the Dominion had secretly negotiated treaties with the Cardassians. The Cardassians agreed to the treaty, and that the Dominion would support them with their ships and fleet. The Cardassian fleet was still decimated from the war with the Empire, and the Dominion were willing to support 10,000 starships to the Cardassian Union, as well as ground forces, several million ground forces. The first objective was to take Deep Space Nine. The Dominion entered with the Cardassian fleet at the same time, showing over 10,000 starships. DS9 had surrendered with no fight, and the Dominion had said that no harm would come to Bajor as long as they would come to talks. So the Cardassians, Federation, and Bajorians sat down negotiating their new alliance. What was negotiated was that the Dominion would not harm Bajor, but Bajor would be occupied. The immediate ceasefire of the Federation pulled back from Bajor, agreeing that Bajor would not be harmed, but Bajor was occupied by the Dominion. The Dominion put orbital defenses around the planet, as well as a massive fleet guarding it, as well as a huge fleet guarding Deep Space Nine and the wormhole. The Cardassians also began building some stations around the wormhole and around Bajor. A huge sense of uneasiness began with the Romulans, the Federation, and the Klingons about the Cardassian-Dominion-Bree alliance. The Dominion reached out to the Romulan Empire as well as the Ferengi in hopes of having a meeting about the new circumstances. The Klingons, the Federation, and all the major superpowers were invited to a meeting held by the Dominion. The Dominion brought in members of the Rebel Alliance to explain to people what was really going on with the Empire, and that the Empire was lying to everyone, and that they were not planning on stopping where they're at, that they were only building up their forces, and that huge, massive fleets were being created in their home systems in the core worlds as we speak, preparing for a massive invasion. The Founders began to explain to all the major superpowers, the Klingons, the Romulans, the Federation, the Dominion, had infiltrated everything, and they had infiltrated the same way with the Empire, going all the way from the average stormtrooper to civilians to the Rebel Alliance to even governors, admirals, and grand admirals. During this process, they had gathered amazing amount of evidence about what the Empire was planning to do and presented it to all the great powers. The Empire was building massive fleets in its core system, as well as dozens of strange super weapons in order to use against the Star Trek universe. Their next plan was to build a huge, massive fleet, come out of hyperspace, now that they have coordinates for most of the known galaxy in Star Trek, thanks to the alliance and trading they had done with the Federation and the Ferengi. They had the ability and knowledge to know where almost all key worlds were, except for with the Romulans. They were perfectly able to now engage at hyperspace, bring a fleet right upon Sol itself, bring a planetary destroyer, and blow the planet up. They planned on executing this simultaneously on all the major super systems' homeworlds, creating a devastating blow to all the great powers, the Klingons, the Romulans, the Cardassians, and the Federation, as well as the Ferengi. After learning that the Empire had planned on committing mass genocide on every system in the Star Trek universe, the empires of the Federation, Romulans, Klingons, Cardassians, Ferengi, and even the Dominion had agreed upon an alliance in order to push the Empire back and stop them from committing the mass genocide they planned on doing. Federation forces, as well as the remaining Rebel Alliance, began an attack on the borders between the Empire and the Federation. The Federation began using any kind of ship that was capable of atmospheric flight to destroy the heavily guarded and fortified worlds of the new Empire. With the combined forces of ships in orbit as well as in the planetary surface with the support of the rebels, they were able to quickly grab some of the planets that had been taken by the Empire. The next step was to start putting fleets at every main system and every hyperspace lane, waiting for the fleets to come in, preparing for this slaughter that the Empire planned. Large Federation sector fleets were formed to guard major planets like Betazed, Sol, Vulcan, and mainstream planets in order to defend themselves from the invasion that was coming from the Empire. The Empire struck fast and hard, and the Federation forces were able to repel them back because of their advanced technology and warning from the Dominion. Major fighting broke out all along the borders of the Federation Empire. Fighting seemed to be everywhere. As the fighting intensified, it came to a realization that something wasn't right. They hadn't attacked Sol yet, and Sol was still not being attacked. They knew that they were only attacking the Rim worlds, and they weren't really sure what they were doing. It was almost as if the Empire was trying to pull forces away in order to trick them, but the Federation wasn't going to fall for this. Grand Admiral Thrawn had given full preparations to destroy Sol. The first thing he did, while the truce was going on with the Cardassians and the Federation, is as many ships as that he could find and salvage of the Cardassian Galor class, as well as their other fighters. He began reconstructing them and building them back into a secret fleet that he was going to use to attack Sol. He had also made arrangements with the Ferengi Alliance by using their black market, and he had paid off Ferengi officers in order to sell him old Klingon birds of prey. His idea was to attack with the Klingon birds of prey, then engage the forces of Sol with Galor-class cruisers, and then bring in the Imperial forces with the Death Star behind it. If successful, this would bring a devastating blow to the Federation. It may even cripple the Federation and Starfleet. One of the Ferengi officers who had been bribed by the Empire let out the plan that the Dominion had warned them ahead of time. So the Empire sped up its plan, and instead of attacking all the major systems, attacked only Sol and Sol only. As the Empire began attacking Sol, they brought in the Klingon bird of prey fleet, who caught the Federation ships off guard, decloaking and attacking them before they even had their shields up. This only gave them a momentary ability to attack, but it was enough to damage a few of the Galaxy-class starships, which were their primary target. Then the Galor-class fleet had warped in. Though both these small fleets were nowhere compared to the Federation fleet at Sol, they were enough to distract them long enough for the rest of the Imperial forces to fly in and hyperspace into the battle zone, now that all ships had been engaging one another. An all-out battle broke out between the Federation and the Empire and its forces. It was like nothing the Federation had ever seen. It was the most bloodiest battle they had seen since the Borg. As the Empire made its way to Sol, they had bring the fleet as well as the Death Star. The Federation knew exactly what the Death Star was there to do and what it was capable of. All forces engaged the Death Star in an attempt to bring down its shields and just damage it enough in order to stop the super laser from being able to fire on Sol. Very shortly, it would be in range, and then nothing could be done. As Federation forces engaged, they were attacked by the Imperial forces and were taking heavy damage, but they were all focused on trying to take down the Death Star. This was the most important target the Federation had ever had. They had to take it down. If they didn't, they would die. There was nothing they could do.
They just kept on firing and firing and attacking, but there were so many ships and they were being overwhelmed. The Empire had dedicated almost all of its forces at this fight just to take out Sol. Federation forces were being overwhelmed, almost 20 ships to 1. As the Federation moved in to attack the Death Star, they were being overwhelmed. They were being attacked from all sides, as well as the Death Star's incredibly powerful, heavy turbo lasers, which were capable of taking out starships in just one shot. These are not standard turbo lasers. Some of the turbo lasers aboard this were planetary turbo lasers, which were capable of blowing even Imperial-class Star Destroyers in one shot. The Federation began attacking it with its torpedoes and quantum torpedoes, doing extensive damage on the hull of the Death Star. But it wasn't enough. The Death Star was still operational. Its shields were being brought down and then being backed up by secondary generators. The Federation just didn't have enough ships in order to take the shields down of the Death Star. It began to move itself into position, preparing to fire on Sol. As the Federation forces engaged the Death Star and the Imperial forces, it became evident that they were not going to be able to stop the Death Star. They just didn't have enough ships and enough firepower. There were too many ships supporting the Death Star. As it moved its way towards Sol, it began entering the Sol system. The Federation kept on fighting vigilantly, destroying as many ships as they could and attempting to take out the Death Star. Unfortunately, it didn't work. The Death Star had moved itself into range and prepared its super laser to fire on Sol. As Federation ships gathered and looked, they knew the destruction was upon them that was coming. It was too late. Sol had been in the range of the Imperial Death Star. It fired and destroyed the Sol system. Several stations, space docks, and space fleets were caught up in the destruction of Sol. This was a big blow to the Federation and Starfleet. This would slow them down, but they were still functionable. Immediate countermeasures were done to pull the rest of the ships back. The Empire began pulling its forces back, being attacked on many different fronts by the Cardassians, the Dominion, the Klingons, the Romulans, as well as the Federation. Starfleet forces systematically attacked all Imperial forces on their border and started pushing deep into Imperial space, taking out as many ships and stations as possible, trying to get revenge for the destruction of Earth. As the Imperial forces pulled back with the Death Star, Federation forces began evaluating the sensor data gathered by intelligence from all the ships scanning the Death Star. They relayed this information to the Romulan Star Empire, which had informed the Federation that they had a 1,000-ton warhead, antimatter warhead placed upon a shuttlecraft, which was small enough to enter the exhaust ports. They had found that one of the exhaust ports led directly to the core, and this weapon would be significant enough to destroy the Death Star. As the Warbird took the data down, they discovered the correct coordinates for the exhaust. They entered the Death Star, entering the core, and then self-destructing and destroying the Death Star.